Now, the 1950 census has gotten everybody in the genealogy world and the family history world very excited, as you can well imagine. But I want to make sure that you are going to get all you can out of that record, as well as the previous census records. Let's get the most out of our census research to save time, as well as find the valuable clues that we might otherwise overlook when it comes to researching our ancestors. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Lisa, and if you are brand new here, this channel focuses on helping you find your ancestors, grow your family tree, and not be overwhelmed in the process. Now be sure and watch all the way to the end of the video, because that's where I'm going to share with you my absolutely favorite all-time genealogy research tip for those census records. Now, exploring census records for our ancestors is really one of the first things that many genealogist researchers do. They are readily available and found on all the major genealogy databases. If you are just starting out looking for your ancestors, you might want to consider using FamilySearch.org for your census research, as they are available there for free. One of the challenges that genealogy researchers run into in those census records is, well, actually just finding our ancestor in that record, right? Now, there are lots of reasons why we might not find our ancestor listed in a census record or lose an ancestor in those census records. I think it's happened to all of us. To increase your chances of actually finding your ancestor in the census record, here's my first tip. Do not conduct a search for your ancestor's exact name. Now, what do I mean by that? It is not unusual at all to find multiple spellings of a person's surname, first name, or both in any genealogy record that you research. Now, one example of that would be in my own personal research. I've discovered over a dozen different spellings, misspellings, transcription errors that for just that surname Howard, which is a relatively simple surname here in the US. So what does that tell us? Well, spelling may not be all that important when it comes to researching our ancestors in the records. But don't tell the school kids that spelling is irrelevant in genealogy. We could get in trouble for that, right? Okay, so what was happening with that? Well, consistent name spelling really didn't happen until the 1900s. And so it wasn't unusual for different spellings to occur. Add in the poor handwriting of a census taker or other record keeper, faded ink, and well, you can start to see how when an individual is transcribing a document for a database, that sometimes those names can morph into quite a number of variations. Other things to think about when you are researching in that census record for your ancestor and trying to find one that's hard to find, maybe it's not a handwriting issue, maybe it's not a spelling issue, but maybe your ancestor went by a nickname. This is where oral history can be very important, or understanding nicknames that were common to a particular region at a particular time period. So you want to consider looking for a nickname. My next tip has to do with locations, and that is to search in alternate locations for your ancestor. Include searches in neighboring counties and neighboring states in your census research. Entire new counties were formed, some ceased to exist, and some had boundaries enlarged or made smaller. When you are researching for your ancestor and you know that they kind of stayed in that same area, but you're not finding them in the census record, make sure you understand exactly what county they were living at in that particular year. It is possible for your ancestor to end up in an entirely different county, having never physically moved, simply because a new county was formed or the county line changed for some particular reason. Don't let that trip up your research. Understand the area where your ancestor lived so that you can better determine which location or which county they might have lived in. This is an important tip, guys. Make sure that the census record actually exists. The destruction of the 1890 census is commonly known in the genealogy world. So for that 1890 time period, we have to use the alternate records such as tax records, etc., for our research. But did you know that there were other U.S. Census losses on a much smaller scale? For example, I spent countless hours researching records, trying to find my ancestors in Halifax County, Virginia in the 1810 census. No matter how many times I searched in the databases, no matter how many variations on their names I put in, I could not find them. And there's a very good reason for that. That 1810 US Census for Halifax County did not survive. So I was spending a lot of research time, valuable research time, researching a record for a record that did not survive. When I looked into that particular 1810 census a little closer, I discovered that there were 18 other counties in Virginia that did not survive as well. That makes a big impact on genealogy research, right? So it got me thinking, on those other records where I wasn't finding my ancestors, was something else kind of going on? So I did a little more digging into the 1820 census and discovered that it was a known issue that enumerators skipped some entire communities within the county in 1820. And unfortunately, it looks like my ancestors were probably in some of those communities. So it's important to understand these types of losses at the much smaller level. Next up, let's talk about your ancestors' neighbors. Now, as I film this, I look out my window. I can look out my window and I have this lovely view of my neighborhood, and I can see my neighbors coming and going, and I know my neighbors, and we do things together and all of that fun stuff. Well, guess what? And in some sense, our ancestors would have done the same thing. They did not live in a bubble. Now, with many of our ancestors in history, major moves or migrations actually happened alongside their neighbors, other family members, or perhaps a community of faith. So when you lose track of your ancestors in that census record, look at the neighbors. Now, it is possible you are not finding your ancestor in a particular census record due to one of those spelling variations that we talked about at the beginning. When this type of thing happens, go back to the previous census record that you had your ancestor in. Make note of who they were living with. Make note of who was next door or maybe 2 doors down. I look on that page and I pick out the neighbors. And then I search for those neighbors in that next census that I'm struggling with. What happens, and what I have seen happen, is that when I find the neighbor, oftentimes I can find my ancestor somewhere else close by. And oftentimes it could be simply that, again, bad handwriting, so the transcription was incorrect, the spelling variations, but it's worth making note of all of those neighbors so that you could then see if you can continue to find your ancestor. Now, my next tip has to do with our female ancestors. And you know, if you have followed me for any length of time, I have a special affinity for researching female ancestors. I'm fascinated by them. And when we research our female ancestors, we know that that research can get tricky kind of quick, right? So when you are researching for your female ancestor in a census record, the best tip I can offer you is to make sure you know which name she is using at that particular time. When that particular census was taken, make sure you know what her name was at that time. Was she single? Would she have still been in her father's household? She'll be under that maiden name. If she was married, or you suspect she had already married, research for her under her married name. But here's where it gets a little sticky sometimes. Did she marry more than once? Because if she did, then with her second husband, she would be under that second married name. So she could have been single in one census record under her maiden name. She could have had her first marriage under another census record. Perhaps she was widowed earlier, she remarried, and by that third census record that you find her in, she's actually under a third name. So it is important to make sure you understand what was happening in her life to make sure you have a better chance at finding that ancestor in the record. Now, this next tip is one that I have shared frequently, and it's one that bears repeating over and over and over again. Do not grab your ancestor and run. Make sure you are gathering the information from every single column that has information recorded in it for your ancestor. The reason behind this is the fact that you can pick up additional clues about your ancestors that lead to additional records that you can then search to hopefully extend your line back further or break down a brick wall. Naturalization information is actually one of the really good examples of this. If you only grab the names and the ages or approximate birth years or marriage status, if that's all you're gathering, then you could be missing some important clues. So if you're not gathering the information, say on naturalization, well then you might miss out and not realize that you should be also looking for naturalization records that could lead to other family members. Or perhaps maybe you've got that naturalization or you know where they were born, but you're missing out on the fact that the information about their occupation. And that's unfortunate because if you know what their occupation is, some of those occupations have their own record collections. And so that's another piece of the puzzle you want to make sure that you're gathering. To make sure you're not missing anything, that whether it benefits your research now or perhaps in the future, make sure you're gathering the information from all of the columns. Now here is my all-time favorite census record tip. Once you find your ancestor in that census record and you've gathered all that data, you're not done yet. Because what I want you to do is then I want you to read the previous 5 pages of census, and then I want you to read the 5 pages that come after the one where your ancestor is listed. Now I know that's a little bit of extra work, right? But there's a reason for this. Now, as a rule, I typically will read 5 pages previous to my ancestor's entry and then the 5 pages after my ancestor's entry. So essentially, I'm reading a total of 11 census pages, right? Once I've gathered all that information on my own ancestor, the reason I'm looking at those other pages, those previous and post pages, is because I'm gathering information on the community. And this helps me understand the social history and the social makeup of that community as well, which can be important to my research further down the road. But if I gather it first, I don't have to go back for it at a second time. I'm already in the record, I can get it, and I've got it ready to go. The other thing is I'm learning about the surnames. I'm learning about who lives in that community. And that's important because as I continue the research into my ancestor and my family, the families, and I take them back, I might start to recognize patterns. I might start to recognize other names, surnames in that community that show up in previous census records or other types of records for my ancestor. So this is important information for me to have now. Maybe it doesn't fit my research right now, but it can in the future, and that's what I'm looking for. If you want to learn more about census record research, love for you to watch one of the videos now on the screen for you.